Hello again. I just today want to give a quick rundown on how we use some of the trend parameters for the Identify Zones Expert Advisor. So I'm just quickly going to use a template I've previously set up. I like to have some standard templates that I use all the time. This one is basically the EA set up with all the user authentication and with no criteria or parameters on it set at all other than the default settings. As you can see, there's quite a lot of lines appear on the chart. It's a little bit simpler when you get up to monthly because it only generally looks up time frames, not down. But then as you go down time frames, you get more lines, more colours, and it gets more and more messy. So just a quick demo of how you can start tidying up this graph a little bit, or this chart I should say. If you scroll down towards the bottom of the parameters, you can see some display parameters, and one of these says parent and all higher time frames against display time frames. If you select parent only, then it will just display the zones relevant to the time frame that you're looking at. In this case it's the 1 hour. So do that, let it refresh, and there you have just the 1 hour zones on it. Okay, now let's look at some of the bias or trend parameters we have. Here we have the mode, so we can apply different types of bias. By default there's no bias applied, so you see every single zone either side of price, supply and demand zones for all time frames. We drop this down, you can see that we've got manual, a selected time frame, the current time frame, that being of the zone of the chart that you're looking at, the time frame chart you're looking at, higher time frame, this just uses the bias based on the higher time frame chart, and H higher time frame, so this is the higher time frame effectively, which is one further up than the higher time frame. So just to start off with, I'll do a simple manual. Now when you're using manual, you need to use this bias manual setting, and we're going to set it to be biased for the up all the time. Say OK, and what we should see is that all the supply zones disappear. There you go, we're only looking to trade on pullbacks to demand zones. This is the same regardless of the time frame you look at. Okay, let's look at some of the other values you can set. Bias type manual, bias type selected time frame. This is when you can actually select not whether it's up or down, but select the time frame to be based on any other, the bias to be based on any other time frame. So you may always want it in this case to be whatever the weekly chart says, or I'm going to change it to whatever the daily chart says, or the trend on the daily chart. So if I say OK to that. Now up on the left here you can see what the trends are on the different charts. So the daily one is set to down at the moment, and we can just confirm that. It's also got some consolidation going on because it has an asterisk next to it, consolidation or retracement. So what this means is it's coming down here, general trend is down, it has retraced but it hasn't actually broken any supply zones yet, so we still consider the trend to be down. Now if we look on higher time frames, these won't be affected by that setting because you can't really apply the daily bias to a weekly time frame. Now we go lower, the trend is down, therefore here you only see supply zones. Here on the 1 hour you also only see supply zones. 30-minute also see supply zones, even though you may see H1 and M30 trends are up. Keep on going, it's always supply zones because it's based purely on the daily chart. Just to show you what happens if we select it on the H1 chart, which has an uptrend at the moment. And these will only affect the smaller time frame charts, the M30, M15 and so on. OK. So now this should flip around to see demand zones, and there you go, because it's now taking its trend from the H1, which is currently up. Right. Next one we're going to do is look at the current time frame. This takes its bias according to the trend on the chart you're looking at the moment. So this is the 15. We know that the trend on the 15, no we don't know because it's not said. Look at 30. The trend on the 30 is up, therefore we have demand zones only being shown. Trend on the H4 is down, so we should see supply zones only. So all these are labelled with S, showing that they're supply zones and they're above current price, with the exception of this one where price is actually inside the zone, but that still counts as a valid zone, valid supply zone. Now, rather than looking at the current time frame, we may want to look at the higher time frame. So you can set the bias type to higher time frame. Now we're currently on the H4 chart, you can see that here. The higher time frame for that is the daily chart, which is currently down, so we should see some supply zones only. And there we go. Now look on the H1, let's look at the M30. That should be, the H1 is up, however I've actually overridden the higher time frame for this in the parameters, which is something I'll just quickly show you while we're on the subject. I scroll down towards the bottom. Just need to find out where I've done with it. Here, HTF overrides. Here you can say that we want the M15 to be overridden by to have the H1 as a higher time frame, or the M5 as your M30 as a higher time frame. As it happens, I haven't actually populated this at the moment, so it just defaults to the next time frame, which for the H4 will be the daily, or if we go to M30 it will be the H1. So the M30 chart should have the same bias based on the trend for the H1 charts, so upwards. So when you're looking at demand zones, I just quickly go to the M30 now, and there we go, we only get demand zones. Have we look at the H1, the H4 is the next one up, and that's got a downtrend, so we're looking at supply zones only. There you go. Now I'll just come quickly back to the higher time frame override. We may, for example, want the M30, the M30, the H1, the H4, all to be driven by the bias on the daily as the higher time frame. So what we can do is actually set the bias for each of these time frames to be the daily using this parameter setting down here. So we just say M30, we'll go to M30 goes to day 1, separated, H1 goes to D1, and H4 goes to D1. So now all of those time frames are mapped to daily as the higher time frame, and this applies right through the EA, not just in this particular instance. So H1 we're on at the moment, daily is down, so supply zones. If we go to M30, we should still see supply zones. There you go. Now a similar thing applies when you're looking at the higher time frame, it's just that it's looking up 2 time frames instead of just 1. So I'm not going to go into that too much at the moment. I'll just get rid of these to get them back to the basic settings and take off all the bias we have at the moment. So we're back to where we started. And now we have supply and demand being shown on the charts. Right, let's have another go on to the other settings around bias. Let's assume now we're going to set a bias for the do it manually for the time being, and we're going to make it trend up. So what this means is we should only see demand zones on the chart underneath price. Okay. However, sometimes we actually want to see zones which appear above the price but which actually occurred or formed prior to the zones that we're looking at, and I call these historic zones. So what we can do is actually exclude those historic zones from the filter by use of a simple setting here: bias exclude historic zones from filter. Set that to true, then we will still see some of the higher zones up here, and these can often be used as targets in our trade. Scroll down a little bit further. Okay. The only other setting that's worth having a quick look at is the highest time frame to apply bias. So for example here we've set a manual trend up, but we only want to apply that to time frames up to the daily, for instance. So we set this to daily. Actually, what I'm going to do is take off the historic zone setting as well, so it's really obvious to you. Okay, so here are our demand zones. We start on 15. Yep, demand zones, demand zones, demand zones, demand zones, demand and supply zones, because we're now higher than the daily. Just to give a second example of that, let's move the highest time frame to apply bias to be the H4 chart. Quickly apply that. See that the daily has supply and demand zones. H4 only has demand zones, as does the H1 chart. So this gives you some idea of how we can apply these trend settings just to filter out the zones we see on the chart. The zones obviously being used to look for pullbacks so we can enter trades or set up orders based around them. I hope that's been useful, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.